Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour. I'd like to welcome you to this panel discussion hosted by the Canadian Ferry Association on the path to greener solutions in the ferry sector. I will welcome our guest, our panelists, but before I do so, I would like to take a few minutes to review technical details. Avant de commencer, je veux passer à travers quelques détails techniques. Et la première chose que je voudrais mentionner, c'est qu'il y aura de la traduction simultanée. Si vous désirez accéder à la traduction simultanée, vous allez appuyer sur le bouton Interprétation qui se trouve au bas de votre écran, au bas à droite. Ça ressemble à un globe. C'est Interprétation. Nous avons un traducteur fantastique qui fait un excellent travail, qui pourra vous offrir la traduction en français, ou si je parle en français, ou quelqu'un d'autre parle en français, qui traduira en anglais. So there will be a simultaneous interpretation offered. If someone is speaking French, you can listen to the English. If someone is speaking English, you can listen to the French by clicking on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. We've got a great translator who's done a fantastic job for us, who will cover any language. Thank you for joining us. We have over 120 people registered for this webinar. It's great to see the interest of all the participants. C'est très intéressant de voir l'intérêt sur ce sujet. Paths to greener ferries goes through various ways, and for the ferry sector, one of the key things that we're looking at are the commitments, the international commitments, and the Canadian commitments that have been made. If we look at what has been said at the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, Canada has signed off on some resolutions talking about a significant reduction in GHG in marine shipping and marine transportation. The Minister of Transport, Omar Al-Gabra, made similar commitments in his meeting with his US counterpart, Pete Buttigieg from the US. So we are here to look at how we can move forward and how we can move forward for Canada, for the ferry sector, for the shipbuilding and associated marine industry, and for the environment, because ultimately it is about the environment. My 4- and 6-year-old would like to ensure that we leave our world a little bit better than what we found it. So I'm going to start by Mark Collins, the president and CEO of BC Ferries. Mark, would you like to say a few words and introduce yourself? And then I'll move it on to Colin and then Andrew. Mark.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Serge, and welcome everybody. Thank you for making the time to join the webinar today. In addition to being the CEO of BC Ferries, I have the pleasure to be the chair of the Canadian Ferry Association at the moment, representing the entire ferry sector across Canada. I can tell you, as a sector, we're extremely concerned with climate change and believe that we have a role to help tackle the problem. Ferries carry about 60 million people a year in Canada. That's about 2/3 of the air travel. So it's a significant transportation mode. And when we see announcements and initiatives coming forward, you often see mention of transit and trucking and aviation and highways, and you never hear about ferries. I think we have a big role to play. We're ready to play it. We have a large number of very motivated operators who've got the technology and the expertise at their fingertips to move ahead. A key message that I'd like to leave with all of the folks listening today is we have to find more efficient ways to get to yes. The solutions are there, but we have a complex governance environment and we have to find some solutions. So I hope we can have some conversation today about how we, working across all stakeholders in making these investments, how we can find a more efficient way to get to yes. Our planet is depending upon it. Thank you, Serge.
Thank you, Mark. Much appreciated. Someone asked already a question and said, is this being recorded? The answer is yes, it is being recorded and will be available on the CFA YouTube channel. Don't try to find it. I've got no idea if it exists, but it will be created within a day or so if it doesn't exist yet. So it will be recorded and will be visible. Mark, you're correct. The ferry sector has not been very visible in some of the announcement. I fully blame John Candy and the Plane, Trains, and Automobiles movie on this. Colin, your turn, please. You're the President and CEO of the Canadian Marine Industries and Shipbuilding Association.
Merci beaucoup, Serge, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. As Serge said, I'm the president of the Canadian Marine Industries and Shipbuilding Association, and I want to say right up front, I am not an engineer. So I am a money man and a finance guy, and so I'm really pleased that we have some experts such as Andrew and Mark at the table to be, if we get a little bit into the weeds, it may get a little over my head, but I would happily commit to making sure that we provide any information that I failed to provide today through Serge to everybody in very short order. SMISA, as I call it, is a relatively new organization. So we're building on the heritage of the old Canadian Shipbuilders Association, which disappeared some 10, 15 years ago. And we began the process of standing up again in the fall of 2018, soft launched in 2019, and really didn't get underway until about 6 months or so before COVID tried its best to shut us down. The principal difference between SMISA and the old CSA is in the name. It's the Canadian Marine Industries and Shipbuilding Section or Association. So what we're trying to do is bring the whole sector together and provide a voice for everybody. It's sometimes an interesting challenge, providing a voice that's both for the yards as well as for the suppliers, the components manufacturers, the designers, et cetera. But that's what we're aiming to do, and we're bringing folks together as best we can to be able to give more of a collective approach to things. We echo what Mark was saying about the marine sector in general. Our yards, most of our suppliers are ISO 14001 or better in terms of their sensitivity to green compliance and making sure that they're strong participants in the environmental awareness part of business. And at the end of the day, we all want to make sure that we are living in a clean, safe environment. So I can safely say that the entire shipbuilding and component sector is 100% on board with the goal and objective of a more green shipping world. One thing that a little anecdote I would just offer is there's a historian by the name of Roger Litweiler who every September 20th puts out a tweet that has a number of different images of ships on it. And why he did that was in 1939, Canada's shipbuilding industry was incredibly small and not very effective. And what he was doing is he was pointing out how 3 years later, on September 20th, Canada launched 12 ships at the same time. Everything from warships to wooden hulled vessels to tankers and freighters. And so my point merely is that when there's a will and when there's a need and when there's an opportunity, frankly, there's a way. And Canadian shipbuilders and Canadian components manufacturers and designers and engineers and software types will all step forward and help make it happen. So we at SMISA are confident that building and maintaining our Canadian vessels in Canada will facilitate a carbon reduction footprint directly as well as indirectly. And we're looking for all sorts of creative ways to work with you to achieve that goal. Merci, Serge.
Thank you, Colin. Much appreciated. Before I move to Andrew, there is another question. Is there a slide presentation and will it be made available to the audience? The answer is no. We have a list of prepared questions But the main thing is we want people to ask questions. The intention is to ensure that the audience has the ability to ask questions. So while once Andrew has done his initial statement, I will go through a number of questions. I strongly encourage you to type your questions in the Q&A session that is found also at the bottom of your screen. So that's would be the answer, Chad. Andrew, thank you for joining us. Andrew is the lead specialist marine shipping and conservation at the World Wildlife Foundation, and the author of a few great emails and thoughtful emails that I've been seeing as I sit on various committees that Transport Canada and DFO have, where we both visibly are on. So Andrew, I was pleased to have you in this panel discussion. Andrew, would you like to say a few words first?
Sure, thanks, Serge, and it's thanks for the invitation to be part of the panel, and I think more importantly, part of the discussion. I hope that we can have a good one. And I think, you know, talking about the urgency or the need, you know, building on what Colin has said, you know, where there's a will, there's a way. And many of you will know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report not that long ago, and I pulled out a little segment from it, maybe to lead off some of the discussion today, and it's a stark message, and I thought it was important to put this conversation in context. It says, unless there are immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limited warming to 1.5 degrees will be beyond reach. And to limit global warming, strong, rapid, and sustained reductions in CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gases are necessary. This would not only reduce the consequences of climate change, but also improve air quality. It is acutely apparent that transformational change is needed at all levels: individuals, communities, business, institutions, and governments. And I think this year in particular in Canada, we've all experienced, or many of us have experienced, climate change, and at a personal level. Wildfires, temperatures, rising floods, oceans warming. It's really hit home for many of us. So that's the why. That's the why this is urgent, why this is important. So conversations like this, I think, are really needed, and I look forward to it today. So thanks very much.
Great, and that's going to lead me to my first question. The government of Canada has made commitments on GHG reductions. It does want to do that in the marine sector. I don't know how impactful it can be on international shipping, but it certainly has the opportunity to put its money where its mouth is on the ferry sector. And there are certainly opportunities that are presented with the greening of the fleet. So I'm going to ask all of you individually. The greening of the fleet presents some opportunities for the ferry sector, for the shipbuilding sector and related industries, and for the environment. Andrew, you touched upon it as well. What do you see as the top three opportunities that are presented by the greening of the fleet, of the ferry fleet?
Over to me, Serge. Is that what you like me to?
Yes, absolutely.
Sure. I think there's a context piece here, which is good to describe. Right now Canada has fairly decent targets for greenhouse gas reductions nationally. between 40 and 45%. Europe and other jurisdictions are going beyond that, and the science is telling us that we need to go beyond that. But it is between 40 and 45% is a strong and good start there. In the marine sector, there are no sector-based targets. It is thought that, of course, the marine sector contributes to our greenhouse gas emissions, but without targets and timelines that are mandated, the incentive or the push for change within the industry is unlikely to happen as fast and as strong as we need it to. The carbon price does apply to marine shipping. The clean fuel standard, it's unclear at this point whether liquid fuels will be part of that clean fuel standard. So without targets and timelines, clear targets for the marine sector, and without a clear indication in a clean fuel standard of how it does apply to marine shipping, I think there's quite a large regulatory gap, and we see that targets matter, right? That's what drives innovation and change. And so, from a policy perspective, in order to move any sector, we really need those in place. So this is it's something that's urgent and something that this new federal government, many of us are hoping, will actually put sector-based targets in place. And we feel that will drive lots of action and innovation. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. And would greening of the fleet, of the ferry fleet, provide a tangible outcome that is reachable for the government to enable it at least to move the needle up? Andrew?
Definitely. I think, amidst the dual crisis, biodiversity loss and accelerated climate change, initiatives such as ferry electrification programs, they're more crucial than ever. The benefits of fleet decarbonization transition are not limited to lower greenhouse gas emissions as well, and this is also an important point. Rather, can extend to environmental benefits such as improved local air quality, reduced oil spill risk, and quieter ocean spaces. Really important here how some of those, the coupling of the lowering of greenhouse gases can contribute to solving some of the biodiversity crisis. So that's also a very, when we talk about environmental benefits or of greening the fleet, there are greenhouse gas reductions, and there are also nature benefits that come along with that greening. Thanks.
Thank you. Mark, the top 3 benefits for the ferry sector of the greening of the fleet.
Well, firstly, I'd like to just absolutely echo what Andrew just said. Tackling emissions, which everybody wants to talk about, greenhouse gases, creates a virtuous circle that has a positive impact on all those other areas: oil emissions, underwater noise, impact on wildlife, and coexistence with habitat. It all gets better. So maybe that's my top one right there, Serge, is the virtuous circle that is created through this activity. It's positive for the climate, it's positive for the planet, it's positive for workers, and it's positive for the ecosystem and the economic climate in the communities in which we operate. Another big opportunity facing us is the opportunity to work together, because I don't know a single ferry operator in Canada that needs to be convinced that this needs doing. There's the technologies there, the will is there. The problem is there's roadblocks. We need to have a hard, serious, direct conversation about the real roadblocks that are moving ahead. On the one hand, we have a federal government that's identified major funding available for this activity. We have operators that want to do it, and we don't have any action. Where is it stuck? We've got to talk about where it's stuck. So that's the next opportunity. How are we going to work together and unblock this system? And then the third one, I think, is maybe a near-term one, is Canada's got a lot of hydroelectricity. And I mean, when we talk about well-to-wake emissions, which is what we need to talk about, the whole chain of the fuel that we're using, we need to consider its impact up and down the whole chain, well-to-wake. Hydro comes out as one of the better ones, and it's ready to go in so many places. Now, I'm speaking to you from British Columbia, and we got a lot of mountains, we got a lot of hydro, so it's okay here. But hydro exists in most places in Canada. It's all relatively clean. I understand it's not zero carbon, but it's amongst the lowest sources. And I think we have a near-term opportunity to make Canada a leader in this. We really got to get going. And I think the ferry sector is very keen to get moving.
Fantastic. Colin, what about you? What are the top 3 opportunities, benefits?
Well, I'd like to echo what both of these other 2 gentlemen have said, and I'll just jump right on to Mark's last point. This is new technology. There is no sort of global leader or globally obvious solution right across the board. And if Canadians writ large, and that's operators, that's yards and technology, that's governments of all shapes and persuasions, actually get together, we could become global leaders in terms of alternate fuels. We could take advantage of, as Mark said, the hydro on the West Coast and the hydro on the East Coast. There's more than enough hydro that to go around in Labrador and in Quebec to be able to make use of it. And one step further, to sort of jump in where Andrew's going to point out, there's renewable energies themselves, which will go a long way towards giving us that clean green energy to be able to produce other clean energies, the fuels that we need for the ships of the future. On that point, I was speaking with one of my members and somebody in the engineering propulsion world, and he made the blunt comment that if anybody's building a diesel-powered vessel right now, the ship is going to be out of date and archaic by the end of the decade. So what he is suggesting is not that these vessels will not be capable, but they are going to be behind the curve in terms of these international mandates or the Canadian mandates for clean propulsion. And so now is the time for us to be looking at what's out there, what's available, and what we can do. And it only makes sense to do it together. It's not like the yards are going to tell Mark, well, this is what you got to do. And similarly, it's got to be that sort of collaboration as to what are we trying to achieve and how are we going to get there effectively and efficiently and in a cost sensitive way. Another component of this is the reduction in supply chains. If we're going to build a ship in Antarctica and you're going to be looking after the maintenance of said ship for 30, 40, 50 years, and you're flying in technicians from Antarctica to look after this, that is counterproductive in terms of the global sort of footprint of these vessels and the carbon footprint overall. To have shorter supply chains is something that I think, especially given what's going on in the global marketplace right now, is just good business. It's sensible for everybody, and it has that positive greening aspect. We have some small niche companies here in Canada that are doing some amazing work, which will address a lot of the concerns, both on the propulsion and the emissions side. But to Andrew's point, on the quietness of the vessels, on the waste outputs of the vessels, there's a whole lot of good stuff that's happening in Canada that we should be looking to tap into. And now I'm dancing all over the map, and again, just to circle back, I think the timing is right to be able to engage the federal government and the provincial governments to really get behind these solutions. So thank you.
I appreciate that, Colin. And the next question is going to deal with a question asked by one of our attendees and also deal with one of my pre-prepared question. Mark, you indicated the technology is there, but if we were to put batteries on the ship doing the link between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, probably we wouldn't have any room for passengers due to the size of the battery. So is the technology really there? And that's the first part of the question. And then is there the capacity in Canada? Colin, you identified great small companies in Canada. They're small, large, medium. There are companies of every size in Canada that are willing to provide their services. When you put people on the ferry, you have a responsibility to provide safety to people, and that includes making sure that there is a proven track record for the technology that you have. So first, Mark, you, then Colin, and then you, Andrew, in terms of how do you see the technology developing to answer some of those important objectives, and do you think the environment sector has a role after that to push for the development of new technologies to enable those sectors to do this? So first Mark, then Colin, and then Andrew. Mark.
Serge, you're quite right. The technology is not quite yet there, the electrical technology at least, not quite yet there for the longest ferry routes. But I think it's important to realize the number of long ferry routes like Marine Atlantic, 9-hour crossing, or the 18-hour crossing on the South Coast are relatively few in Canada. The vast majority of ferry routes are short. And so let's start with those. And by the time we get all that done, the technology will have advanced to the point where the long ferry routes are probably feasible to go electricity. So we can get 80, probably 90% of the ferry routes in Canada electrified before we need to solve the technical problem facing Marine Atlantic and my two routes, which go from the top of Vancouver Island up to Haida Gwaii and 18-hour crossings. We don't need to do those first. So that's a relatively small emissions win there for a very difficult technical challenge. Let's take the low-hanging fruit, the short runs that are pumping out the vast majority of emissions and all the undesirable waste streams. We can solve those now. The technology exists right now. Stena this week announced that in Europe, they're contracting for a 60 megawatt hour battery pack. That's the biggest battery afloat. Okay, so we're getting there. Our biggest routes, we need about 100 megawatt hour battery pack. This is within reach. We can do this, we can do it now, and we should get going.
Great. Colin, is there the capacity in Canada to supply the technology, to supply the brain trust and the innovation there?
Yes. Simple answer, yes. Engines, of course, come from somewhere else. Canada does not manufacture engines. It's basically the only part of the vessel that we don't do domestically. We do everything else that's attached to it. We've got propeller manufacturers, shaft manufacturers, bearing manufacturers, everything that goes around it. But the only thing we don't do is the engine itself. Europe is ahead of us in terms of embracing and implementing new fuel technologies. And Mark is bang on. We don't need a one solution fits all right now. A short crossing could be readily changed or converted over to electric. But something that's a little bit further, for example, Maersk just did a 12-ship order for ocean crossing vessels that are going to be methanol powered. Those are, that's one of the largest entities in the world. They're making a big bet on that type of propulsion. So they're going to need those fuels wherever their ships go. Well, there's an opportunity for us to start looking at, well, if the big players, the really big guys are doing this, and we in Canada, if their ships are going to come here, are going to need to provide resources, well, perhaps we should be looking at our longer routes, Marine Atlantic and BC Ferries and whatnot, as a possible solution. Perhaps not right now. Perhaps it's the next iteration of these vessels, possibly. But it's something that we should be exploring now. And for some of these longer, perhaps slightly older vessels, there are enhancements. You can use certain, just like going to the gas station down the street and having ethanol put into the fuels. There are ways of adapting things to make sure that, well, to ensure you have a modest reduction. So there are little steps that we can take. There's the low-hanging fruit that Mark is saying is available now and we can implement now. And then there is the medium-term things of the more advanced technology solutions.
Thank you, Colin. Before we go to Andrew, I just want to refer to the question from Arnon Treben, who mentioned that most shipbuilders, designers, and owners are ignoring Canadian manufacturers and going overseas. How do we overcome this? And Arnon, if I may say, the reason we are having this webinar, and we had another webinar and panel discussion with Samisa, is to get the conversation going, to get people talking together and finding solutions to do this. So keep joining us with Canadian Ferry Association events, MISA events, and you'll hear increasingly collaboration on this. Mark, you're not, I've never heard you say that you're opposed to working with Canadian suppliers, correct? On the contrary.
Not at all. I mean, I know we built our ships overseas in recent years, but our position is we would love to build in Canada, but I also have a duty to the fare payers because there's no public funding in our capital construction program. It's 100% funded by the users of British Columbia ferries. And so I have a responsibility for them to fight for a good deal. And there are structural challenges facing the Canadian shipbuilding industry, which I'm extremely sympathetic to. But nonetheless, I do have a duty to the stakeholders who are paying my bills. We got to solve that. We need to solve that. I absolutely agree with Colin about the desirability of a short supply chain. I have a ship down right now, and I'm waiting for a technician to remote in this case, from Germany. To do some troubleshooting. Fortunately, this guy's coming in virtually, but it does illustrate the challenge we face. But want to shorten those supply chains, would love to build locally, would love to see that economic activity, but we've got these structural challenges. That's an example of some of the roadblocks I'm talking about. The roadblock's not the technology, it's not the willpower, it's not, to some degree, it's not even the money. Although when we're talking about big incremental changes to infrastructure, we do need to talk about funding. But in the base load of our business, it's not even really about the money. It's about breaking down those roadblocks in that gets us to a competitive playing field.
Thank you, Mark. And indeed, I think the government coming to the table would help somewhat solve some of those issues. Andrew, is there a responsibility for the environment sector to push for the development of new technologies and to push even the government to support this? I see a question here in terms of, is there a responsibility for the ferry industry to create demonstration hubs, as DND has done for their IDS program? Is there a responsibility for the environment sector to say to the government that they should work with the ferry sector to push those ideas, to demonstrate what we can do in order for us to put them in place?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great point, everybody. There is just to point to an operational side of this. If you reduce speed or you optimize speed from vessels, you can see some studies have said a 19% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and up to a 40% reduction in underwater noise pollution. So some of the solutions here around the climate crisis and the biodiversity emergency aren't technologically driven and can happen overnight. So there is an operations side that we always have to keep in mind, because that's the short-term solution to many of these issues. And also, I'm afraid I'm going to sound like a broken record, but we need a zero date, meaning we need a zero emissions date, which includes CO2 and methane and black carbon and nitrous oxide, right? And we need targets and timelines to get to that zero date. That's what's going to drive innovation, right? That's when people have to do things, and it's not voluntary or it doesn't come down to, the bottom line. So I don't know how much I can stress that, is that we don't currently have that right now for the marine sector. So also the last thing I'll say on this piece is, and this is, you're sort of pointing to, the environmental sector. There are initiatives being launched every day, which are pressure initiatives. And for instance, Ship at Zero just launched a few weeks ago. Ship at Zero, all one word. You can look it up. And it's focused on players like IKEA and Walmart and Amazon. And it's talking about electrification and zero emissions by 2030. And so I think you're going to see many more of these public pressure campaigns bearing down on the shipping sector, including the ferry sector. There's the Getting to Zero Coalition, there's the Poseidon Principles, the Global Maritime Forum, the Ready for Zero Port Coalition, the Sustainable Shipping Initiative. There's Trafigura, which is a proposal at the IMO about a carbon tax, a very high carbon, or a levy globally that ramps up to $250 a ton. So you're going to see more of this. And generally how change happens from an environmental point of view is, the public and corporate social responsibility. There's the finance sector. There's green technologies and how rapid those can be deployed. And the big one is regulation. The big one is those targets. So, that's the recipe, but the main ingredient is really a target that's mandatory and is aligned with, the scale of the problem, which is aligned with 1.5 degrees. That's really important. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrew, on this. A question comes from the township of Frontenac Islands. What can be done to have the ferry service meet the designation of public transit and have it included more prominently in a green infrastructure initiative for the federal provincial governments? So I'm going to throw it to you, Mark. It's a question from one of our members actually on this one.
Thank you, Serge. I'll give a BC Ferries example, if I may. We have a proposal right now out there to electrify 4 ferry routes involving 6 ships. And it's roughly $150 million investment to get those done to full electric zero emission operation. We've put up 50 million. We've got the province in for 25 million, and we've approached the federal government under net zero accelerator funds and things like that, attempting to identify a program that would apply in this case. And while we've got many expressions that yes, this is in line with what we're doing, we're still stuck. It hasn't moved forward. And it's difficult to say what the problem is, but we do know at the same time that we've been working on this one, funding for buses seems to be flying out the door. And so somewhere along the line, there's a focus on buses and transit. And I recognize, there's hundreds of millions of people use buses. And so that's a big opportunity. But we're lost somehow. Ferries and you got to take a lot of buses off the road to take one of my big ferries off the road, so to speak. So there's big point benefits to working with the ferry sector that at least as yet we have not been able to make the case clearly enough. So we're working as best as we know how in Ottawa and here in Victoria with governments to say, yes, transit's important, but ferries are important too, and we have something to contribute. And can we get an understanding of our sector out there in front of the key players who are in the in the decision-making roles around this funding, and say, how can we be on an equal footing with transit? I don't have the answer yet, but we're certainly trying to make that case.
Colin, on your side, I don't know how many large ships you're going to build for Amazon, but you have the opportunity to work with the ferry sector. So what do you say about making sure that the ferry sector becomes more visible in the federal initiative that would benefit your members?
Well, the simple response to that is we'll do whatever we can to assist you to work with us to find appropriate solutions. And needless to say, we are of the belief that those solutions can be provided in Canada by, in the vast majority, by Canadian firms. And we're 100% on board with what Mark is pointing out. You have a bus route or a light rail transit, and you can get the government's attention relatively quickly. But something that's just as important as a bridge or a road or a light rail transit to a more remote community or an island, for example, tends to get ignored. It's key critical infrastructure. And if working together is what it takes to get that through to the decision makers in Ottawa and in provincial capitals, then that's the direction and the solution that we have to follow.
Thank you. And Andrew, on your side, what's the cost of doing nothing, right, for the ferry sector? What's the cost of the federal government and some provinces saying, you know what, well, let's just focus on buses and not deal with the ferry sector? What's the cost of doing nothing for the whales, for the belugas, for the communities that are being served, for the marine environment?
I think that that dual space, you know, the biodiversity crisis and the climate emergency, is really an opportunity for the marine sector, but also, you know, more acutely the ferry sector, because you can reduce emissions and reduce underwater noise with retrofits and the same amount of investment. So those agenda items, you know, you can really tackle them, and the government and you know, civil society should realize there's a real opportunity with the ferry sector to do that, because, you know, reducing emissions reduces underwater noise and habitat destruction. The key thing about underwater noise, right, is that, you know, cetaceans and whales need sound to forage and communicate. And then when their listening space decreases, it's a direct impact on their habitat and on their ability to survive. And so when you look at orcas on the West Coast, it's such an acute problem with the sudden resident killer whales. You know, ferries can have a direct impact by making investments in reducing emissions on that listening space of orcas and the health of that species. So that's quite important. I also say that 80% of, you know, greening the fleet in shipping, 80% of the solution lies on land, and investments in renewable energy on land and plug-in opportunities for vessels. It seems, you know, when you scour the internet and you look at some of the technology for ferries, I just the other day came across the Amherst and the Wolf Island ferry delivery, fully electric with diesel backup engines. You know, all these press releases seem to say, you know, the ferries are there, but we'll get to the plug-in later. So they're going to be using diesel for a while until the on-land infrastructure is there. So a lot of the investment really has to happen at that interface, you know, on land. And so to green the fleet, you need to invest on land. You know, 80% of that investment needs to happen there. But just getting back to this, there really is an opportunity for this sector with the dual crisis of biodiversity loss and greenhouse gas emissions. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Mark, what's the cost of doing nothing? And I see your hand up too.
Yeah, because I wanted to pick up on a point that Andrew said. Let me just illustrate the plug-in or the part that land plays here. So on the $150 million project I mentioned a few minutes ago, for us, it's a curtain raiser. The real prize is hot on the heels of that. We have to replace 5 large ferries worth about $1.2 billion when you take into account the shoreside infrastructure it's going to take. We want to go all electric or similar zero emission fuel. But again, in BC, electric is the most mature and most promising. But when I talk to BC Hydro, they've got lots of power. But you know how long it's going to take to put in the transmission line to one of our terminals? 10 years. 10 years to get a hydro line put in, right? And you go like, that's one of the structural problems I'm talking about. Even if the money were available, it's going to take 10 years. Why? Because you've got about 8 municipalities to go through. You've got 3 First Nations. You have multiple levels of senior government with all different permitting processes. And sometimes I wonder if they speak to each other. Pardon me to be blunt, but it's very difficult to navigate. We'll put together a team of 30 people who will spend 5 years to get to the point where we feel confident to issue an RFP. And the RFP is the very first stage in doing a project. So it's seeing a project come to life, if you will. So that's what I mean is the planet's not waiting for us, right? The planet's on fire now. So how are we going to take that? We need that transmission line, to be suitably assessed. I'm not talking about throwing any one group under the bus here or ignoring important concerns, but how do we just do it more rapidly? How do we get that transmission line? Can we suss it out in a year instead of 10 years? Because then we can get on with making those shoreside investments, which is going to unlock the potential of decarbonizing ferries.
Great. And I see Andrew's hand up, 1 hand, 2 hands.
Yeah. Just to also make a point here that the Clean Fuel Standard is a credit system, right? And so early movers are going to be a place where later adopters are going to park their credits or need credits. So you'll be rewarded for any sector will be, but particularly the ferry sector. People are going to be shopping for credits. So if you can make the right investments and put those electric vessels in the water, you're really going to benefit. There will be a medium and short-term benefit with the Clean Fuel Standard and people looking to buy up credits. That's how the Clean Fuel Standard is designed, and my understanding is that the marine sector is part of that. Also, and everyone knows this, the carbon tax, the price on pollution is supposed to by 2030 go up to $170 a ton. That's in 9 years, and it's supposed to ramp up year over year. So there will be major advantages for these early adopters, and the ferry sector is really poised to be one of those early adopters because batteries can service shorter routes, right? That's the kind of crux of it. That's why it's working in BC and in other places. But there will be advantages, or there are advantages for those early movers.
And Andrew, I appreciate that, and I'll go to Colin on that. But I'm looking at my member who's servicing Northern Ontario with the Government of Ontario route in the remote area serving a First Nation. She's not getting electricity to service a remote community. She doesn't have any options, right? So she's going to be penalized in 2030 because she's not able to bring any type right now of alternative fuels. But I'm looking at Colin, who I'm sure is going to solve that issue. So first Colin, and Andrew will go back to you. Colin, what are your members going to do to solve my members' problem in Northern Ontario?
Well, I'm not exactly sure the specifics, but there was an interesting vessel launched down in California, I think it was just in the last number of weeks, and it was a hydrogen fuel cell solution. And so that's something that's a little more esoteric, but it is very much low emissions or zero emissions, if I'm not mistaken. And that type of technology would be something that would be more appropriate for a remote location that doesn't have access to electrical resources. And then circling back to the challenge that Mark and BC Ferries are having about, there's all this wonderful, electricity, but it's over there and we're over here. I think that's where we can all be working together. We start looking collectively at what the big guys are doing. And again, I use Maersk as an example. If they're going to start a fleet, because their first ships powered by methanol are expected to come down the ways in about 2 or 3 years. If they're going to have vessels like that going across the ocean, and if they're going to be on a route that touches Canada, we need to be able to refuel them. If we need to refuel them, then we need to have the technologies in place to create the fuel. Well, if that makes sense for some of the international carriers, perhaps it's what we need to be looking at for some of our ferry systems and for some of our other Canadian domestic needs. So there again is one of those things where it's an interesting way of being able to get the shipbuilding community, the operator community, and I'd be operators writ large, as well as the energy community, all pulling together and looking for solutions. So that was one of the thoughts that I had. The other thought, and I think we come back to environmental a little bit later, but Andrew was talking about some of the other things that are not necessarily emissions as in smokestack emissions. But we have some really interesting companies in Canada that are doing some cutting edge stuff. We have a firm, if you can believe it, in Ottawa of all places, that manufactures propellers. And these guys claim to have propellers that have lower cavitation, which means it's a more efficient propeller that's quieter. So you have a company such as that is able to, if everything goes as advertised, you have a solution that's good for the whales and good for the operator. We have a company, we've got Thornton Bearings that everybody knows, that they claim their bearing systems are such that you're going to have virtually no oil residue or whatnot coming out of the shaft assembly. Again, it's good for your operator, it's good for the environment. Another firm we've got is Tarragon Environmental, which has small units that go inside vessels that can take black or gray water or oil waste and treat it in such a way that you can actually dump it right into the water because it's been totally cleansed. Now, I'm not advertising for any of these specific companies and saying that they're going to do exactly as advertised, but I'm saying we have those companies here in Canada that are producing technology that can address a lot of the concerns. And we need to make sure that we're integrating those into our solutions when and if they prove themselves up to snuff.
And I'll go back to the alternative solutions, but first I want to go to Mark, and then I'll go to Andrew with another question for you, Andrew. First, Mark, you've got your hands up again.
Yeah, again, to pick up on something Colin just said, there's a role here in the theme of working together. There's a role here for society to help out as well. So take the ferry operator up north you talked about, Serge, who's not going to have an ample supply of electricity, and they're not going to get methanol anytime soon. What can they do? Well, society can help out, but what about reducing the frequency of the service so that we burn less fuel? There's a help right there. We're actively exploring schedule changes here in British Columbia to slow down. We were driven by underwater noise, as Andrew talked about earlier, but it's also, of course, you're saving fuel. But communities get wedded to their ferry schedule. And then a ferry operator feels that, if we don't meet that schedule, the community feels we are failing in our duty. If we're going to solve this, we're all in it together. There is a role for societies and communities to come on board, municipalities to say, we support the effort to reduce the impact on the environment by understanding that sailing ferries empty just because it's on a schedule makes no sense. And that's literally, we have a ship in northern British Columbia that does 14 round trips a day. It has an average utilization of 26%, right? So 84% of the time, if I got my math right, 74% of the time, it is empty, yet it sails, because that's what my contract says, right? So we need to work together on a societal level, say, does that make sense? And we can go a long way to helping reduce our footprint if we can optimize the capacity that we're being asked to provide.
So I wouldn't be doing my job as a moderator if I wasn't going to be pushy a little bit. Andrew, you're my first push on this. So you've heard from Mark about the hurdles, right? The barriers, and often those are regulatory barriers, right? So the government has put in place a whole bunch of regulations that make it almost impossible for some improvements to be made, or make it extremely difficult and delay by years. The latest one, as an example, well, I'll give you an example. To repair a cable ferry, now you need to get a ministerial permission to do this, because there is a ferry cable that goes across the waterway. So to repair that cable, you need a ministerial permission. They almost asked whether to maintain the cable, you almost needed a ministerial permission. That ministerial permission usually comes after a year requesting it. For reference to anybody attending here, you maintain it at least 4 to 6 times a year. So you'd be writing to the minister very often. Andrew, is there a role at one point where we say, this is wonderful, we've got so many regulations, so many steps to go through, so many hoops, that it is also preventing innovation and preventing progress? Is there a problem, do you think?
Have I mentioned that we need targets and timelines to? I mean, I think you're the targets and timelines are kind of in a league of their own when you're saying less red tape is what's going to lead to innovation, and I'm saying targets and timelines are going to lead to innovation and a real push from that sector. So, I agree. There are times when that really gets in the way, but if sectors aren't compelled through regulations, especially on tackling hard problems, no one's saying that this is easy. I mean, it's very difficult. But if you look at the science and the recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, we don't have time to waste, right?
Great.
We have to get back to the scale of the problem here is urgent and immense. And we need to quickly get to reducing emissions, drastically. If you look at these, there's been a few studies about, plotting the different emission curves, right? And how quickly we need to get to zero by 2050, and 1.5 degree aligned is actually 0 by 2040. There are more and more, 0 by 2040, and there are more studies pointing actually that we need to be 0 by 2040. The International Maritime Organization targets are 50% by 2050. Climate change is taking hold at such a rate that those targets are quickly becoming out of date. So I agree with you that there's lots of red tape in the world, and who needs it? But without those targets and timelines, we're really not going to see the drastic change that's needed.
Agreed. And I think if the targets and timelines are able to help the government look at their red tape in a bit of a better light, I think you will get everybody's agreement on having targets and timelines. And by the way, I don't think anybody in the ferry sector is reluctant to have targets and timelines. They want the opportunity to do this. They want the opportunity to implement. I don't think anyone in the Canadian Marine Industry and Shipbuilding Association as well doesn't want targets and timelines. I think they want the ability to get things done. And that requires a number of things, including cash, including innovation, including a reduction in red tape, including a federal government and provincial government that sit down at the table with the sectors, I should say, looking at Colin and Mark, and get things moving. I'm going to go to some of the questions from the audience, and I do realize someone has raised a hand. We do go through questions through by reading the question. So if you do have a question, Bruno, please do ask it in the Q&A. That's the process we're putting out. We will lower your hand, but if you can, please ask your question for the Q&A. So a few questions. Trevor Butler, the same issues exist for alternative fuel, LNG, hydrogen, ammonia, methanol. Where do vessels get those fuels on a easy basis? And indeed, another question from Eric Barker deals with the same thing. Have we looked at other technologies as well? Have we looked at other opportunities? In view of the time, it's 3:32. I'm going to ask for shorter answers from our panelists. Mark, it's going to be a difficult one. A shorter answer, Mark.
You know me too well, Serge. We're looking at all manner of fuels to see what works. The problem is supply, right? LNG, we went over to LNG recognizing it's a stopgap, it's a fossil fuel, it's a stopgap, it helps, but it is not the ultimate solution. But we had to do something, otherwise we'd be too far behind. Electricity seems to us to right now, at least to be the next most promising, simply because hydrogen, methanol, ammonia are not in abundant supply. So we're putting our time, money, and effort into those things that we know we can get, we know we can implement, we know that the expertise exists in Canada to use.
Appreciate that. Colin, do you want to get on that question as well?
What I would do is I would propose that we actually collaborate. We look towards collaborating on something now. I look at some of the names on our list, and we've got some really powerful, intelligent, capable individuals here. And we should be looking at putting together some sort of a working group to go through the options. There are a tremendous number of options. Mark and I and Andrew have thrown a few of the better known ones on the table, but they are not exclusive. It's not as though something else isn't a strong potential. We would be happy to host some sort of an event and bring in some of that technology expertise so that we can bring everybody up to sort of an awareness and an understanding level as to what is possible and what is still, shall we say, a little bit more fanciful. So we would be only too happy to take a lead in terms of trying to bring everybody up to the same level so that we can collaborate and move forward together.
Andrew, do you want to say a few words on that?
No, just to echo what Colin has said about the need for collaboration here. You know, the seaside and the land side, as I said, 80% of the investment needs to happen on land. So there needs to be, and Mark, very amazing illustration about some of the hurdles in getting, power to tidewater, so to speak. So a lot of collaboration, needs to happen there. Policy tools will help that, and I think with those federal policy tools are coming along. They need to be improved, and as I said, the ferry sector can really benefit on the credit side for early movement. Thanks.
Thank you. And indeed, having collaboration to look at some of the solutions is important. I see also some of the names of the people there. Paul Dobre from Hitachi, who's working on the electric grid to bring electricity to the market where it needs to be, and other people as well. I'm going to go back to the question from the audience. Ragnar Radke, who, when he crossed the cable ferry 2 years ago, the ferry in the river was propelled by an engine and propeller. A few years ago, across the river in Weiser, Germany, the ferry body was adjusted to an angle so that the current would propel the ferry. This does not work everywhere, but some smaller regional ferries could benefit. Ragnar, you don't have to go to Germany to find the solution. We have them right outside of Montreal. You'll see a couple of ferries being propelled exactly that way. So don't travel all the way to Germany for that. We have Canadian-made solutions. I'm going to echo Colin on this, that have worked very well on this front. Jean-François Gauvin, aren't you worried that the foreign suppliers have proven technologies and ships will be further favored by operators, as recent record suggests? So the old broken record, Mark, of those ferry operators will only buy overseas. How do we put this to bed?
Yeah. Well, we don't agree, actually. We, as I talked about earlier, at least in our governance structure, I have a duty to secure the most cost-effective solution for the people who are paying for the ships, which are ferry riders. As I say, there's no government funding in our capital program, so there's not this spin-off argument. But Canadian electrical technology is some of the best in the world. I mean, we've got a lot of Canadian electrical gear. And we have some great integrators. That's another key part of going electric. And I know I don't mean to sound like a broken record on electric. I know there's other solutions out there, but electric has got a lot of near-term potential. And there's some great integrators, some great designers and engineers here in Canada. So I think an electric ferry is going to have a very different procurement outlook than a traditional diesel-propelled, steel-built ferry. But at the same time, the ferry industry is very thinly capitalized, right? Most of our incomes are just barely exceeding our costs. So if you're going to have a premium to adopt a new technology or adopt a new place to build your ship, you got to deal with the premium. And where is that going to be dealt with? So that's another structural issue that faces the ferry industry. It's not like we're sitting on giant profits that can be just redeployed. That is not the case. So we need to answer that question if we're going to solve the market issue.
Great. Andrew, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just really quickly, a comment on biofuels. I think as part of the decarbonization pathway, there's some opportunities there in the short term. Second generation waste feedstock biofuels can be easily integrated into current engines, and they do have a smaller greenhouse gas footprint. So there's some opportunities there, but they're a short-term solution. Also on LNG, more and more studies are showing that LNG isn't really much of even a medium-term solution when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. There are some air pollution benefits, but with methane slip and marginal GHG gains, we really have to avoid locking in investment around LNG. Because it's not proving to be, effective greenhouse gas emission solution. I'll also say on ammonia, there are ammonia vessels being developed and piloted, and we've heard about hydrogen as well. There's also a lot of the trimming, the smaller, wind assist and solar and hull forms. There's a whole package of retrofits. Waste heat, using waste heat that can contribute, that can shave off 5%, 10%, 15%. And I'm also, mentioned the operational issues. We've talked a lot about underwater noise here and slow steaming or speed optimization. So, you can chop away at some of the, greenhouse gas emissions as well. So when we look at, there's a whole basket of solutions that we really have to apply to this, kind of urgent problem. Thanks.
I appreciate that, Andrew. One question was, did we consider solar ships? There are solar ships in the planet. It is being put in. I just wanted to share that picture for a few seconds. I hope I shared my picture for a few seconds.
You did.
There are different technologies available. Colin, would you, for your association, develop a list of different technologies and different technology suppliers in Canada for some of those alternative energy proposals that ferry operators could look at.
Absolutely, we would do that. And just a quick response. Mark has said it all with regard to electrical. We have some great companies. There are great solutions here in Canada. Andrew's covered off on a whole range of other sort of propulsion technologies. The two other points that I wanted to make from some of the items that folks have said is that there was Mark made the comment about a steel built hull. Steel itself, the federal government has promised to make a rather large investment in Algoma Steel to ensure that their steel production processes are very green. So that is, it's a small part of the overall picture, but if we're looking at trying to reduce our global footprint, using Canadian steel in a Canadian hull is something that is more environmentally sound than using steel from certain other jurisdictions in this world. And then the last comment is, Mark, about cost issues. Absolutely, we can't avoid that, and we've got to find some creative solutions in order to be able to make sure that appropriate price points are found. I would point out that as a rule of thumb, I think, and Mark would know this infinitely better than I, that the 25% of the price of a vessel is the building of it, and the other 75% is the maintaining and operating it for its life cycle. So we need to be able to take a look at the sort of overall picture and make sure that it makes sense for the operators, and so that all parties can come away happy.
Thank you, Colin. I appreciate that. Before I go to the next question, if I didn't do what my event organizer extraordinaire, Christine, told me to do, I would be in trouble. So I do want to thank BC Ferries, La Société des Traversées du Québec, Wärtsilä, and Oggia Ferry Systems for sponsoring some of our events this year, including this one. Thank you to the four of them for doing this. Mark, you may not remember that you did sponsor this, but you did. Thank you very much. And Stéphane, I know you're on the line as well. Thank you very much on this, and so of the others. Interesting question from another one of our member. When we talk about the cost of electrification and the benefits, has there been please comment on the full cost of electrification by taking in consideration the cost of producing batteries, with the recycling, the cost of and impact of bringing high power capacities to the docks, etc. Will there be savings at the end of the vessel's lifetime? And that, I think, is an important element to look at. Maybe I'm going to start by Andrew on this. Have you done any research? We talk about electric ferries, but there are environmental costs in the batteries, there is environmental cost in the disposal, the production of the electricity, etc. What have you looked at this a little bit?
Yeah, I think the quick comment here that I'll make is the life cycle analysis. This is well to wake for alternative fuels and for currently used fuels, is a very active discussion at the International Maritime Organization. And so WWF is part of a group called the Sustainable Shipping Initiative, which is developing criteria for this analysis. And many of you may know that the Intersessional Working Group on Greenhouse Gas Emissions at the IMO just finished. I believe that was last week. My weeks are blurring. And this discussion, this life cycle discussion, was launched at that. It's called ISWG. So I'd encourage technical experts and financial experts to really dig in and dive into that. I can share a link or however, Serge, to the report that we've done on life cycle analysis. And it takes into account many of those social factors, environmental factors. Yeah, that is a very live discussion, and so it'll be had over the next year or so. So I encourage people to participate in it. Thanks.
Appreciate that. We would love to participate in this, Andrew, and please do send me the link, and I'll share it with attendees and especially our board on this. And I know we won't get to all the questions, and some of the questions will be referred to more directly to individuals after that, and we will try to respond to the questions that have not been answered live in a different way. Bruno Cacciagli, who is with Lake Ontario Express, one of our members, and thank you, Bruno, for lowering your hand and typing your question. How much work, if any, has been done to the award of carbon credits based on the saving of an electrical ferry usage compared to other means of transportation, such as car, buses, or trains on the same route? Mark, any answer on that?
Well, I'm pretty far from a carbon credit expert, but I can tell you our experience out here is that the provincial government has recently adjusted the rules around fuel credits in British Columbia to enable the ferry sector to take advantage of it. Interestingly, it was designed that the fuel supplier used to get the credit, not the fuel consumer, and that's been adjusted now. The fuel consumer gets the credit. Which seems to make a lot more sense to me. Happy about that. So applying it to our near-term project, the $150 million project I talked about earlier, it generates about over the first 20 years of the life that those ships are electric, about $25 million in value, in credit value that are monetizable and saleable by BC Ferries. So that's a real $25 million value towards the price of the project. That is significant. That helps get to yes. Didn't get it all the way to yes, and not yet, but it's very, very significant. So for these market-based mechanisms, I think there's a real place for them. They don't work for everyone, but they certainly work for some organizations, and I really encourage continue policy development and removing frankly, some of the absurdities that are built in there. I think the absurdities come about for some arcane policy or special interest group reasons, and we've got to say what's more important, that special interest group or the planet, and take out these absurdities like giving a supplier a credit for selling carbon heavy fuel. Doesn't really make a lot of sense to me.
Appreciate that. I'm going to go for a few other questions and target them to specific panelists. One of the questions is nuclear power being considered at this time for the large long-range vessels? And I remember sitting at the European Commission office in Brussels with their marine team, and they were laughing at the idea of nuclear power. 2 years later, they confirmed to me that they were funding a research project on that effect. There are various technologies from solar to anything else. Andrew, what do you think of nuclear power?
It's a complete non-starter for WWF because of the safety and waste issues. So we don't consider it a viable short, medium, or long-term solution.
Okay, fair. That's what I expected. I remember that point of view. That's why I asked. Mark, Colin, any follow-up on that?
I would jump in on that. I don't have a position to argue with Andrew, but I would point out that there are, at least one of our members is exploring some test work on small nuclear reactors, and they would be useful either in vessels or in remote communities. And the differentiation that he would indicate, or he has indicated to me, is that they're not the same type of reactors and reactor technology as you would find in, say, a US nuclear submarine. They are far different in terms of their radioactivity and whatnot. I do not speak to Andrew and his group's concern about waste and whatnot. I'm not going there, but there are Canadian companies that are exploring this as a possible avenue for power.
Mark, are you willing to stay completely out of it?
I'll just, as a practical matter, it's so far away and so expensive that I just don't know how a ferry company could ever get there. If it came to us as part of a utility that was going to act responsibly and address the concerns that Andrew has stated. I suppose you'd look at it, but you wouldn't really be a nuclear person then, would you? You'd probably just be taking the electricity. But as an actual operator, it's just so remote that we have done no serious work on it at all.
Okay.
Actually,
So
to that point, if one of these small reactors was in that remote Northern Ontario or territorial community, then it would allow for the production of enough electricity to drive a battery operated ferry that plugs into the mains when it comes back to shore. So there are possible arguments for it, and again, I defer to Andrew as to whether society wants them or not.
So I'll move to my last question, looking at the time, and I'm going to limit panelists in their response. The question is really the question of this panel discussion somewhat. I think I'm hearing a ferry sector that's wanting to move towards greening the sector. I'm hearing that there is a marine industry and shipbuilding association and its members that are willing to support it. I'm hearing from Andrew that there is a real need to get this done quickly with targets and timelines. Andrew, you will not have to mention that in your response, but although I assume you will, because my question is going to be, what can governments do? And I'm going to give you 2-3 minutes, top 2 or 3 things that the governments can do for you tomorrow to make this happening. And I know on behalf of the ferry sector, it does require coming to the table with some resources. But Andrew, I'm going to start by you.
Okay, sure. I guess obviously targets and we all should be interested in targets and timelines, because that's really what's going to drive innovation. And because of how the ferry sector is, how the services is rolled out, those dual biodiversity crisis and climate crisis, there's really an opportunity there for the ferry sector, and could take advantage of those targets and timelines. I'll also say that a tightening, effective clean fuel standard and a high enough carbon price that's actually uniform across the country. We hear about this kind of dog's breakfast with the carbon price on carbon and how it's applied in various provinces and how there are exemptions. We need a unified approach to the carbon price. And I think lastly, there are so many smaller changes that can be made operationally that can contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and an efficient ship is a quiet ship is a cheaper ship to run. And so there's a lot of opportunity in that space, whether we're talking about propellers or hull forms. So I think I'll leave it at there. Thanks.
Thank you. Mark, I'm a policymaker, a policy analyst. I'm going to propose something. I work in the government, federal, provincial. I'm a DG or whatever, and I'm going to report. I'm going to try to say, coming from this webinar or this panel discussion, here's what I should be doing. What can you tell that person they should be proposing to government officials?
Yeah. I would ask them to execute on the programs which are in place. We've got a government which, well, assuming the new government looks a lot like the old government, they've stated their political objectives. They've stated their desire. We've got projects that line up that meet all the criteria, yet they're not happening. Something is in the way. I would ask that the people who control these programs identify the blockage and break it. If it involves the operator, if we're doing something wrong, they need to tell us, because you have my 100% dedication to fix it. But nobody is telling me what the blockage is. So we need to find that blockage and we need to get it out of the way. It does appear to be an intergovernment issue.
And Colin, you represent a Canadian association, as I do, but the decision is not just federal, it's also provincial. What do you tell provincial governments and federal governments? Do you tell them it's time for you to work together? I'm listening to Andrew. There is a big need to move things quickly. Can you, provincial and federal government, get together to make this happen sooner than later? We can't wait. Or is that something that is appealing to you, or are there other solutions?
I think it's extremely appealing, and our members would be only too happy to get behind it. There's the business case. Let's get people back to work soon, quickly, and so that's that infrastructure dollar concept at work. It's supporting our operators to make sure that Canada and Canadians have good, clean, effective transportation solutions, and it's supporting innovative technologies, whether it's in the yards or whether it's in the components manufacturers across this country. It is a win-win-win solution as far as I can tell, and it will resonate with governments everywhere. The idea of multiple sectors coming to the table and saying, help us to help you to make for a better Canada, I think is a compelling discussion. And then the last piece that I would also be suggesting is the governments could be looking much more seriously, and to Mark's point, much more rapidly towards fuel solutions of the future. We're going to need them, and we should be paying a lot more attention and moving an awful lot more quickly.
Thank you very much. Colin, I know we talked about penning a letter to government officials to tell them about the importance of moving towards electrification for ferries or other solution, the greening of the sector. Andrew, we may come to you and say, here is a letter that tells the government we need to move faster and we need to look faster for support. I think it would have certainly it would make good common sense to collaborate on something like this, to bring it from all the sides of the sector. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. And I'm hoping the message is resonating. Lots of people from the federal government, from provincial governments. We have MLAs, MPPs in attendance, so that's great. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Colin. Have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Serge. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Cheers.